One of the most fundamental questions for nation-states is the issue of a national language or languages. Language is often a driving factor in the drawing of borders and the creation of specific nation-states. After all, law itself needs a language or languages for its content to be communicated to the public. We consider this dynamic in more detail in the Living Law topical episode, Law and Nation. In this part 2 of our episode on law and language, we focus on the often tough choices political leaders must make in relation to language. The need to make such choices can result from a number of factors, including historical migration and settlement, colonization or empire building, as well as regionalization or integration amongst individual nation-states. We will cover all categories in this segment, taking examples from the Living Law Nations series. Starting with historical migration, Norway provides a good starting point. The majority of Norwegians descend from continental European peoples, who settled in the region in such numbers that over time they dwarfed the native Sami people. As in other countries, a belief in the superiority of the newer arrivals' civilization and culture led to a paternalistic and dominating approach to dealing with the indigenous peoples. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, successive governments had followed a policy of Norwegianization, with an educational program favoring Norwegian over the Sami language. Things did not begin to improve for the Sami until the second half of the 20th century, as they began to exercise various civil rights. This culminated in an amendment to the Norwegian constitution which obligated the government to support the Sami in preserving their culture. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the legislation was the degree of autonomy gained by the Sami, who now had their own parliament known as the Samadegi. One of the Samadegi's primary responsibilities is the promotion of the Sami language in Norway.
In 1987 came the Sami Act, and in 1989 His Majesty King Olav V opened the first Sami colony.
Norway is now seen as a model for a more humane approach to dealing with national minorities, including correcting mistreatment from the past. Belgium is another European nation where language is at the heart and often at the throat of the country as a sovereign nation. Today, Belgium has 3 official languages: French, Dutch, and German. The German-speaking residents reside mainly in the border areas with Germany and are estimated to make up less than 1% of the population. It is the contest between the other 2 language groups which most influenced the evolution of the country. From its very beginnings, Belgium was faced with finding a workable balance between the 2 major ethnic and linguistic groups, the Francophone Walloons and the Dutch-speaking Flemish. In the 21st century, there are questions as to whether Belgium will remain as a single nation. Despite the considerable level of autonomy and devolution, there are still periodic calls for a separation drawn on ethno-linguistic lines. Whatever the Belgians decide in the end, it is another example of the crucial role played by law in relation to nationhood in general, and language in particular. As if juggling 3 official languages wasn't challenging enough, just a few hundred kilometers southeast of Belgium lies a nation with 4 official languages. The name of the country is in yet another language, Latin, just for good measure. The background behind the policy of polylingualism in Switzerland traces back to the origins and evolution of the country. We explore both in that country's Living Law Nations episode. In a nutshell, as the territory of the Swiss Confederation expanded beyond the 3 original cantons, all mainly German-speaking, it grew to include other language groups. The language list grew to include French and Italian to reflect the majority language of populations of newer cantons to the west and the south. Though not as well known, the language known as Romansh also later became an official language. Romansh has its roots in Latin, harking back to the time when the influence of the Roman Empire extended even into the mountainous regions which are now Swiss territory. Thus far, the cases we have looked at involve countries whose language situation was more or less a product of voluntary choice or historical evolution. But there are huge parts of the planet where the dominant languages were introduced by outsiders, as opposed to being native ones. Central and South America provide a great example of this. The discovery of the Americas by the Spanish and Portuguese dramatically altered the linguistic situation in those regions. The Age of Exploration began at a time when a unified Christian church was a dominant factor in European politics and law. The division of the New World into areas of Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence was legally set out in a series of treaties. The division by European monarchs and church leaders largely explains the political and cultural boundaries of the individual nations in Central and South America today. Diseases such as smallpox decimated the local indigenous populations, thus facilitating the rise of Spanish and Portuguese as the predominant languages across this vast area. The continent of Africa had a similar experience. The territorial borders of many African nations today have their origins in agreements reached between European powers during the period of colonialism. The arbitrary nature of some of these boundaries meant that they cut right through some indigenous ethnic and linguistic groups. Where a European power remained in control for a considerable period, they often left their language, law, and aspects of their culture as a legacy from that period. In the course of decolonization, many newly independent African nations ended up retaining the language of the colonizers as an official or national language. Decades or more of exposure to and education in these European tongues meant that the languages were deeply ingrained in many societies. In some instances, this even helped political leaders avoid tricky decisions of choosing amongst one or more of dozens of indigenous tongues. Even today, both insiders and outsiders tend to divide Africa on the linguistic lines left behind by colonization: Francophone, Anglophone, and Lusophone. Germany also had colonies in East and Southwest Africa, but the legacy of that period is not as great given the relatively shorter period of German involvement in Africa. The same applies to Italy, which had its own colonies in North Africa. India is another example of a former part of a European empire forced to make decisions on language policy upon gaining its independence. After more than a century of British influence in India, English became a kind of lingua franca for the Indian people. Somewhat ironically, the language of rulers from outside became a neutral tongue for communication amongst the hundreds of ethnic groups across the territory many having their own language. Today, English sits alongside Hindi as one of the national languages of India. Asia reveals a similar storyline. The return of Hong Kong to China after almost a century and a half of British rule left the former trading post an international city and a crossroads between East and West. In an effort to preserve the value that went along with that status, the Sino-British Agreement aimed to preserve Hong Kong's institutional autonomy for a transition period of 50 years. At the time of making this episode, many are concerned that the commitments made at that time will not survive the full 50-year transition period. We explore those agreements and their impact on the people in the region in the Living Law Nations episodes for Greater China. Not all transitions from one dominant language to another go smoothly. Upon the breakup of the Soviet Union and the independence of several Soviet socialist republics, the new democratically elected governments were faced with some fundamental policy decisions. We explore a number of cases in the Living Law Nations series. After decades of Soviet rule and a communist form of government, many republics had seen their native tongues lose their previous dominant position to the unifying Soviet tongue of Russian. In Living Law Estonia, we saw how language rights played a central role in the human rights movements of the 1970s and 80s. In what came to be known as the Singing Revolution, thousands of ethnic Estonians exercised their rights of expression and assembly to participate in massive traditional song and dance events. After independence, the sudden reversal of fortune of the language of ethnic Estonians caused considerable friction with the large Russian ethnic minority. The initial laws regarding language and citizenship led to outright conflict in the early years following independence. The situation was similar in the other Baltic countries. In Living Law Latvia, we explore how immigration in the post-war era had completely shifted the ethnic mix in the country. The political leaders after independence struggled with similar challenges of balancing language rights against the desire to restore the Latvian language to its former status. There were similar tensions unleashed between the linguistic and ethnic communities, as the tables were turned here as well. Across the Baltics, the desire to join the European Union forced a moderation of some of the initial laws and regulations. That factor is an interesting one in relation to language policy. In the case of colonialism, a society has laws imposed upon it by outsiders, including in relation to language. Joining a political economic grouping, on the other hand, is a voluntary act based upon a careful weighing of the pros and cons of membership. In relation to the European Union, there have been several examples where the result of such debates was a decision not to join. Not all citizens of such countries are on board with sacrificing some of their national sovereignty. This applies to language policy as well. The Living Law Latvia episode highlights the massive operational challenges when joining the European Union, especially those triggered by its policy on official languages. In the next segment of this episode, we explore language as the subject of law.